ago, my then girlfriend, I'll just call her Erin here, was finally sick of my crap and kicked me out. I don't blame her. I was a hot mess back then. No jobs, no prospects, happy to just coast through life on her dime. And the only thing I was really passionate about was vacationing. The camping had been Erin's thing, and I was more into partying with the boys and going on spring break type vacations. But Erin had convinced me to try camping early in our relationship, and I was immediately hooked. I got to party and have fun in the evenings, but hike and feel at one with nature during the day, like it was actually achieving something. We had this one campsite we'll go to regularly, which Erin had been visiting with her family since she was a kid. It wasn't completely remote, but not super commercial either. A mixture of individual campers and groups dotted around an area that had sporadic park ranger patrols. Erin and I had our usual little spot, and that's where I dragged myself on my lonesome, tail between my legs. Erin had thrown me out and told me it was over, and I was feeling extremely sorry for myself. We planned the camping trip for months, and I convinced myself that I was somehow defying her and her accusations that I was codependent by going alone. Now, I'll also admit that I had the faintest hope that Erin would show up at the site herself, either alone or with her family, and we could have some big reconciliation. That didn't happen, obviously. A family did show up, though, only it was not Erin's. I was kind of surprised to find a car near my tent on the second morning of my vacation. It was unusual for people to camp right next to each other if they were strangers, and in all my time visiting that campsite, I'd never seen anyone camping in that particular spot either, because it wasn't exactly the best ground for it. But that morning, as I blinked and ate my way through a hangover, I watched as the Johnson family, as I'll call them, unloaded their stuff and set up their tent. I picked up that they were the Johnsons by sitting there in my fold-out chair, defiantly munching on sausages and staring at them in the hope that they'd go away. I wanted to make my presence as unwelcome as possible and either pick a fight or be left alone. It reflected the dark mood that I was in, and I'd come here to get away from everything, commiserate over Erin alone, and here was some nuclear family with 2.4 children and a perfect life. It felt like a kick in the face from the universe. I continued to watch them later in the day, looking over the top of the book that I was reading, and it soon became clear that they were far from the perfect family. For one thing, the mother and father barely spoke to each other. All I could hear was the dad constantly yelling at the two kids, a boy and a girl, and he kept saying things like, "The Johnsons do not conduct themselves like this," and "The Johnsons help each other," and "The Johnsons don't act like brats." The name wasn't actually the Johnsons, I forget what they actually called themselves, it was something similar though, and it started to give me a headache, hearing him yell at his kids in his high-pitched, nasally voice, and it kind of amused me though, to see how the kids just entirely ignored him. They acted as if he wasn't even there, and occasionally, when he'd really raise his voice, they might glance in his direction or even laugh at him, but for the most part they just sort of chased each other around. They only seemed interested in hurling insults at each other, these two weird little kids. Now, they must have been about 8 to 10 months old, but some of the crude things that they were yelling were way too inappropriate to share here on YouTube, and the worse their insults to each other were, the angrier their dad got. Meanwhile, the mom of the Johnson family sat on some portable sunning chair, the one thing that she'd removed from the car by herself, and just sort of watched. When the day started to get really hot, I kind of just was shocked and a little embarrassed to notice that she'd started sunbathing without a top on. The dad seemed to notice this too and saw that I was looking, and it stressed him even further. Now, I could tell that he wanted to say something to me, but he also wouldn't let himself. Now, for my part, I was in a bad mood and wanted to pick a fight, so I refused to be intimidated or move. And besides, in the language of the schoolyard, I was here first. And I started doubting whether I wanted to get into a fight with the Johnsons, though. The father got increasingly angry with his kids, speaking to them in a way that I'd never even heard a parent speak to their children before. And at one point, he grabbed the son's arm and yanked it so hard that I was certain that the son would react. He did react, but not in the pained and hurt way that I expected. Instead, He just called his dad some slur and ran off chasing his sister again. And the entire family was utterly and horrifyingly obnoxious. Well, I'd first thought the universe was taunting me by showing me what I could have had with Erin. Now I thought it was saving me by, well, showing me what I could have had with Erin. Childish, but I was directing my anger at her towards this awful family, sitting there just scowling at them while nursing my beer. Eventually, it became overcast and the mom got dressed again. The family built a campfire in their designated fire pit, the one benefit to the place I'd chosen to set up camp. I watched as the horrible children ran around it, getting dangerously close to the fire. Dad Johnson kept shrieking at them, threatening to beat them. The mom kept stealing looks at me and offering me little smiles, even a flirty wink. Now I knew I should have turned my chair away or gone off to do something else, but I was being an idiot. I was also kind of enjoying how angry this father was getting and reveling in my role in it. I'd circled back around to the kind of drunk where you're happy to pick a fight and don't care who it's with. Only a few beers deep, but enough to be a dick. Now this is probably one of the reasons Erin kicked me out. You could tell the father wanted to say something to me too, and I was kind of disappointed when the evening ended and he hadn't, and I was forced inside my tent by a chill wind that had whipped up. Now I went inside my tent to read by flashlight and had to listen to the screaming awful children and the screaming awful father for what felt like forever. Now eventually I realized that I'd drifted off to sleep and the campsite was silent. I needed to pee badly, so I crawled out of my tent and made an excursion into the outskirts of the woods. By the time the Johnsons' tent was silent, there was no sign of any disruption or trouble. I went back into my tent, suddenly freezing cold, and tried to go back to sleep. Now, shortly after, though, I heard yelling from the direction of that horrible family. I rolled my eyes, figuring that we were back to bad behavior again, but I quickly realized that the yelling and screaming had taken on a different tone. The mother and daughter both seemed to be screaming at each other about something that the daughter had done, and I don't know whether they were talking about the father or the son, but I'm sure that I'd heard the mother yell something like, "What did you do to him?" That one sentence made my blood run cold. I tried to summon up some of the bravado that I'd felt earlier so I could drag myself out of my tent and go over there to see if they needed any help. Then I heard a crack and a slap, and some more screaming, and decided that maybe it was probably best if I stayed put. I did have some cell reception though, so I placed a quick call to the cops to inform them that, that terrible family camping next to me might literally be killing each other right now. Now helpfully, this dispatch put me through to an officer who informed me that the campsite was outside the local police jurisdiction, so I could call the park ranger for any non-emergency issues. I tried to explain that I was pretty sure that they might be hurting each other, but I guess something about my slurred words or delivery caused them to doubt me. Now meanwhile, I tried to reconnect to the painfully slow 4G to Google the number for the park ranger, and on the next tent over, the Johnsons seemed to be shrieking at each other again, and one of the male voices had joined in that fray. I couldn't tell if it was the son or the father with how high-pitched and shrill the father could get. I don't know for sure, but taking into account the things that they were screaming at each other about, I'm almost certain that one of the kids had either killed the father or killed the other sibling. At least the mom seemed to think so, and was screaming at them about getting out of here and making things right. I know I was a total coward by hiding in my tent, but I cannot stress just how intimidating and horrifying this family had become. To this day, I've never met people like it, so I kind of just continued trying to call the park ranger while pretending I wasn't actually there. Eventually, it became too hard to ignore, though. The screaming died down, and through the wall of my tent, I could see what looked like flames starting to glow. Now, I was pretty certain that it wasn't the campfire either. That was it. And enough was enough. Time to insert myself into that situation. And so I dragged myself to the door of my tent and began to unzip it. I was going pretty slow, trying to delay the inevitable, and that's when I glanced up and saw the family's 4x4 light up and start gunning right towards me. And holy God, they were going to run me down and crush me, it seemed. and I would be absolutely obliterated by their vehicle. I managed to tear that tent open and throw myself out of the path of their vehicle just in time, and everything I'd brought camping got churned up under the wheels of this now speeding vehicle, and I watched in horror as the Johnsons, whichever members were alive anyway, went barreling off in their vehicle. I'm still furious at myself that I wasn't able to memorize their license plate. I called 911 again, and this time they took me seriously when I told them someone had tried to kill me. The cops showed up shortly after, by which time I managed to put the fire out that those Johnsons had left behind, literally, and the blaze that I'd seen through my tent had been their tent on fire. It wasn't as serious as it looked, and I managed to extinguish it with just a few water bottles and dirt, and as I doused it though, I was almost certain that I'd seen a body in the smoldering wreckage, although whether son Johnson or father Johnson I wasn't sure. I didn't see a body though, so instead I was left to dwell on the sickening sight of that 4x4 speeding towards me in the darkness. I was extremely lucky that the driver, the mom I assumed, switched the headlights to a low beam. If they had been off entirely, then I might not have noticed that the vehicle was headed straight towards me other than sound. If they'd been full, then they might have blinded me. I run all the different variations over in my head whenever I think about it. It's the closest I ever come to dying by far. I'm not ashamed to admit that even 5 years later, I'm still in therapy over this, and it's the sight of that car charging towards me that I always end up coming back to. The rest of the story really isn't that interesting. I gave my story to the cops. They promised to keep me informed, and they never did. I have no idea if any member of that family died that night, and I do know that they would have happily killed me if I hadn't dodged out of the way at the final second, though. I don't know if they were aiming for me or simply forgot that I was there. I just hope it was the latter, but I think it was the former. Either way, screw you to the Johnsons. I hope that your horrible family was caught for whatever crimes you committed and you never had a chance to hurt anyone. I hope those kids managed to get the care that they needed, and the one silver lining was that my encounter with those Johnsons made me feel grateful that I was single, and I kind of stopped dwelling on Aaron very quickly after something like that. I'm still single to this day, and if married life is anything like it was for the Johnsons, then I'm happy to stay away. So I have this absolutely weird quick story from a time when I went camping alone. I guess it's not the most safe thing that you can do, but I did it a lot and still do. And this one event caused me to take a little break from camping by myself though, and it still creeps me out to think about it. So I was off the beaten track on a trail that I'd plotted myself out in the Adirondacks. I'd hung out in this area a few times, just reading and chilling, and not for a couple of years though. Now this time, I was 2 days into the 3-day trek that it would take to reach my usual camping spot. Now on the way, I saw some pretty odd things. Specifically, I saw a bunch of trees filled with holes. Now okay, you might say to yourself, some hunters have been using them for target practice. That's what I thought too, at first anyway. It wasn't really a hunting area, but that wouldn't have stopped some local kids from coming out here and firing harmlessly into the trees for fun. When I examined the holes more closely though, they didn't look like bullet holes. There was no splintering and not much breakage in the bark around them. It looked like they'd been drilled. Now I remember watching a YouTube documentary about a farm in Canada that makes maple syrup, and it reminded me of how trees get tapped for that. Now I'm pretty sure that these weren't syrup dispensing trees though, or even maples at all. They did leak sap, but it was normal, stinking tree sap that had dried in a few of the holes. Now the further I went in towards my planned camping spot, the more trees that I found with the holes drilled in them, and I was super confused. Was this some kind of woodpecker, or maybe a creature? Now, the deeper into the woods I got, the fresher the holes seemed to be as well. Some of them were still leaking this sap, and they absolutely stunk. I have no idea what kind of trees I was encountering. I really wasn't all that into nature or like a nature buff or anything, but they absolutely stank of, well, how do I really describe it? You know the scent when you've just mowed the lawn, but you leave the cuttings out a bit too long and they start to sort of smell bad and maybe even weird. And then you throw some wet bark in there and maybe some food leftovers and make compost. That's kind of what it smelled like, but maybe more tangy. Certainly nothing like delicious maple syrup. Now, against my better judgment, I put my finger against the sap and licked a tiny dab from my fingertip. And it was freaking gross. Nobody would be tapping this to eat it, I imagine. Well, I was proven wrong as I made my way through the trees some more and saw the man. He was drilling a tree with what looked like a handle-operated hand drill. He hadn't seen me, so I crouched down and watched him from behind a trunk. The guy was drilling into the tree and then sucking the sap directly from it. After he'd inhaled a bunch of that sap, he'd throw his head back and make this disgusting lip-smacking sound. I felt kind of sick, knowing how plant-like the sap tasted. If the guy hadn't been wearing clothes and using a human drill, I would have thought that I'd encountered a Sasquatch or something like that. He was huge. He was tall, hairy, and he was sucking on a tree. That ain't normal human behavior, bro. And so you can imagine why I wanted to just sneak away and avoid interacting with this guy, right? Well, screw my life, I suppose, because I tried to sneak away very stealthily and covert and immediately stepped on a stick. And it cracked like a freaking bomb blast in that silent forest. Now, straight away, I heard the sound of thundering footsteps and turned just in time to see this tree sucker charging right at me. And he seemed absolutely furious that I'd been watching him drill and suck on trees. And yeah, it sounds funny to describe it, but trust me, it was not funny to have some huge angry man charging you down in the middle of nowhere. He was waving that drill over his head too, and all I could focus on was the handle spinning around. Thankfully, I snapped out of that daze real quick and managed to start running. The guy was intimidating and scary, but he was huge and slow, and I was young and fit. After a few hours of heart-pounding pursuit, I was confident that I'd lost him. I'd also managed to run off onto a different route and could no longer see any drilled trees, so I felt more secure knowing that I was in an area that guy obviously wasn't familiar with. I managed to reach my car and civilization by pushing myself pretty far. I took a couple of naps in some ditches, not wanting to set up my tent or do anything that could slow me down. It was a miserable and scary experience. And later, when I was close to the car, I found more trees with holes drilled into them, and that put me on the defensive again, but thankfully that sapsucker didn't show up again. I made it back to the car and hightailed it out of there, and I have not been back to that area since, which I think is quite understandable. Now, I don't know what the huge tree-sucking forest guy would have done if he caught me, and I certainly don't want to go back there and give him the chance to catch me again and find out exactly why he was even doing what he was doing. If you go camping off the beaten trail in a bunch of places in America, but especially the Appalachian Trail, you're guaranteed to find some very weird things. Now, I have a whole catalog of strange sights I've seen, either in groups or by myself, but nothing beats the time that I stumbled across an entire set of dining furniture rotting away in the absolute middle of nowhere. Now, when I say the middle of nowhere, I absolutely mean it. This wasn't somewhere that it was feasible to dump your trash. This table and 6 chairs must have been carried for days through the woods, as far as I could tell, and it would have taken a bunch of people to carry it here. And that's why it was so strange and unsettling. And the chairs were actually set up around the table, as if it had been installed here as some kind of picnic spot. Only, this wasn't any actual trail or any location that would be nice to chill and hang out at. It was just sort of there, in the overgrowth. The wood was all wet and rotten, and insects and crap were swarmed all over it, and it was pretty disgusting, and naturally, a lover of the creepy and strange, I loved it. The dining set might not have been a good spot, but there was a clearing a few hundred yards away that offered a perfect camping site. I decided that this was as good a place as any to set up for the night, and so I pitched my tent and went about heating up some stew on my camp heater. Now, later that night, I was lying in the tent, completely unable to sleep. I was just taking in the sounds of the forest and the chill vibes of being alone in nature. This was my favorite part of the whole experience, honestly. At least, usually it was. That night, though, I felt the hairs stand up on the back of my arms as I heard a number of footsteps coming through the forest. Not super close, maybe a few hundred yards away, and you can guess exactly what direction they were probably coming from. I waited for the sounds to die down, then all I could hear was the low murmur of talking. I unzipped the tent ever so slightly and crawled out. There was a faint light coming from the direction in which I'd seen the dining table, and so I got my singular binocular out and tried to watch. There were 3 younger men seated at that rotting dining table, and then one older guy who I swear to God even had an eye patch. The night was near silence, so I could hear snatches of their conversation, and it seemed like they were playing some type of card game at the table, but they were also talking about their kills. They were very clearly poachers because they were talking about shooting and stealing deer from some nearby private land. And then I heard one of them ask something about what they were going to do with the other body. As I listened in horror for some time, it became pretty clear, at least in my head, that these 4 men had killed another person and were planning on how to dispose of their body. From what I could tell, the man that they'd killed was some type of family member, and he had it coming, according to them at least, but they were discussing the best way to discard of that body. I tried to convince myself that I was wrong, that they were talking about an animal, but the more I listened, the more I was sure. And then I realized that I had a major problem. They had no idea that I was there, but if they found out, would they even hesitate in doing something bad to me as well? I had no idea what to do. I could stay silent and dark in the tent, or I could try crawling away to hide just in case. I knew running would be a mistake because they would almost certainly have firearms and knew the land way better than I did. And my God, I'm so glad that I picked the option to crawl into a hiding place. I dragged myself out of my tent and sort of army crawled across the ground until I found an overhang ditch that I'd seen earlier in the day. I tucked myself in there and covered myself with some grass and bush, hoping that even if they saw my tent, they would probably overlook me. Well, they eventually did see my tent, and when they went to look and eventually decided that I must have abandoned my campsite, I was actually surprised at how quickly they gave up because, hot damn, the way they talked about things, I'm 100% certain that they would have ended me if they'd actually found me. But nonetheless, I stayed in that ditch for hours, long after the men had left, just lying in that hole, too scared to really even breathe or step out. I had to pee myself twice, I'm not ashamed to say it really, and eventually I gathered the courage to drag myself out of my hiding place and just hightail it out of there. As soon as I reached the car and could drive to a spot where I had cell reception, I phoned the police. Now, this was a few years ago, so finding cell reception wasn't easy, and I wasn't able to give the cops much. I didn't have a clear description of the men, and I wasn't able to pinpoint exactly where I'd seen them. They asked me to go into the local station, and I did, but they seemed more frustrated and annoyed with me than anything else. The cops promised that they'd let me know if they needed anything else from me, and I gave them my home phone number and email asking them to promise to give me any updates. Well, I never heard anything else, and in the years since then I've scoured any sort of local news of that area in Appalachia for any news of a body being discovered. But here's the depressing thing. The answer isn't there was never a body found. Instead, bodies are found all the time out there. I have no idea if one of the many unidentified dead people who have been discovered in the years since were potentially the victim that I'd heard about. All I know is that it's very dangerous out there and you probably shouldn't go hiking alone like I used to. Now I know, you probably heard it in Zelda, but it is dangerous to go alone. Camp in groups, friends. Don't find yourself hiding all night in a ditch like I was. I'm a female listener in my early 20s. Before I start the story, I'll tell you all up front that I am safe, warm, and well these days. I have a long-term partner who I live with, and I'm no longer homeless or in any danger. That wasn't the case a few years ago, though. I was living rough, either sleeping out in the open in the sleeping bag, or for a while I had a small pop-up tent until it got all slashed up. I know some people prefer the term unhoused for when they were living rough, but not me. I know what I was. I was homeless. I did not have a home. I didn't have a community or a single safe place to stay. And it was hell. I hated it. I felt like I had to be constantly on the move, sometimes multiple times within the same night, and it was an extremely unsafe, unpleasant world for a young woman like me, and it's frankly a miracle that I managed to come out the other side of it relatively unscathed. Now, I genuinely do believe that it was a miracle, like someone was watching over me, and I had so many narrow misses and managed to scare off so many different predators. There was one incident that really stuck with me, though, and it was the closest I ever came to something terrible happening. It was the final day I got to spend with my pop-up tent. I didn't know that at the time, of course, but yeah. I was dog-tired because I've been walking all day, so I set the tent up under what seemed to be a remote overpass. It felt like I was in the middle of nowhere, as I've been walking kind of aimlessly for a while, I guess. Now, I'll admit I was floating on some kind of substance I won't name right now, and when you're living rough, you take whatever escape you can get. I always tried to keep things very grounded, though, just enough to take the edge off. I had a little food squirreled away in the tote bag, so I allowed myself something to eat to lessen the gnawing hunger that I always seemed to feel. It was fall and fairly mild, but the weather was set to worsen soon. I was not excited about the prospect of spending another winter on the streets. I read a few magazines that I managed to find and a 3-day-old newspaper that I've been holding onto for warmth. The location that I picked seemed completely remote and isolated, and for the first time in days, I let myself drift off and drop my guard. Now, I woke up startled. There had been a loud sound from outside my tent, sort of like a bark or something. I heard it again and realized that it was a laugh, like a single, raspy laugh. And the laugh sounded like it was coming from someone very old. I could hear the telltale rattle of smokers' cough in their lungs as they laughed a third time. I had to make a decision: stay hidden in the tent and hope this guy moved on, or introduce myself and make it clear that I wasn't someone to mess with. I didn't actually have time to decide either way. Before I even had a chance to move, a very heavy body plunged onto the tent. It was almost like he jumped on me from a height, and I'm pretty sure that's exactly what he did. It was almost like some type of wrestler move, except I'd soon discover that he was just some dirty old-ass man. Now, he managed to come ripping through my tent fabric with some kind of blade. Now, I picked up on the blade first and was immediately on high alert. A fat hand holding some kind of box cutter burst through the wall of the collapsed tent, flailing towards me. I kicked out and managed to catch him by surprise, so he actually dropped the knife, I think. Now, the first thing I did was grab it and cut the tent wall behind me so I could pull myself free from the fabric. I scrambled onto the cold, dirty ground and dragged myself to my feet. And that's when I saw him. This huge monster of an old man who'd apparently swan dived onto my tent while I was sleeping. He was absolutely filthy, and he stank of, well, you can only imagine what homeless people stink of. And the whole time he flailed and wriggled, he kept letting out this single rasping laugh, too. There was a single flickering light under the overpass, so I was able to see a few details about this man. His face was completely scarred, and his nose was kind of burned away like an addict's. He had a cleft lip and his tiny, evil little piggy eyes. When he actually saw me, as in he saw that the inhabitant of the tent was a young, small female, he managed to get to his feet very quick. He had this look on his face then, predatory but also wary. I guess he knew that a lone woman sleeping rough can be hella dangerous out of necessity, especially now that I'd already gotten hold of his knife. And because of the way he was looking, I assumed that he'd case me out and be careful. But no. Before I even had a chance to realize what he was doing, this huge, stinking man barreled into me, crashing across the ground and pinning me to the floor with his huge belly. Now, his knife went flying out of my hand and I immediately felt my heart sink. No time to dwell on that, though. His bulk was completely crushing me, and I could feel him pressing against me in ways I really obviously didn't want. And since I'd lost that blade to defend myself, I decided to just try and punch him repeatedly on the side of the head instead. His head seemed to be his weak spot, I think, and after a few hits, I even started to see a cut, dripping blood onto my own face, and that stinking old guy was just howling. Still laughing too, though, like he was extremely high on obviously something. He rolled off of me and I scrambled away. The dude was rolling back and forth on his back like some fat turtle, and it would have almost been funny if I hadn't been so terrified in that moment, my heart absolutely pounding. All of my worldly possessions were in that crushed, slashed tent, so I couldn't just run either. I had to grab up my tote bag first, and no way was I leaving everything for this a-hole. I quickly ran across the tent and fished out my bag out of that wreckage. And just as I thought that I was about to get away, I felt some hand grab me by the ankle. I slammed to the ground hard, and I later found out that I actually sprained my wrist pretty badly, which was kind of a miracle to think that that was the worst injury that I suffered from all of this attack. The guy pulled me towards him, muttering something I couldn't understand in the moment, and I don't even think it was English. He didn't seem to be American at all, but I have no idea what language he was even speaking. Maybe nothing coherent. His mouth seemed to be bleeding from me cutting into his frail skin, and one of his eyes was sort of leaking this disgusting yellow crap. He was an actual monster in my eyes at that time, and this was my worst nightmare, the kind of thing that I dreamed about at my lowest point. There was no way that I was letting my life end at the hands of this disgusting predator, and so I swung my bag hard, hit him again in the side of the face. He tumbles backwards, and I stomped down on his crotch with all of my strength, and then I just ran. And I didn't stop running until the sun was up, and I was back in a populated area. Now this was the wake-up call I needed to straighten my life out. Now I won't go through all the explanations on how I did that because that's the non-scary part. Thankfully I did though, and in the time that it took to finally get a bed to sleep in, I never encountered anyone else like that horrifying guy. This was only a few years ago. I wonder if he's still out there though. It's not like I went to the cops or anything, as that would have been totally out of the question for a person like me at the time. On the other hand, he looked like he was basically falling apart, so I'd be surprised if he'd survived much longer beyond that. Now, maybe it's not very Christian of me, but I kinda hope he's dead. He was a monster who tried to suplex a sleeping woman and do God knows what, and I'm pretty sure he has nothing positive to offer the world. All he exists as now is the face that I see when I have the worst of my nightmares. Be careful if you're ever forced into homelessness, kids. Don't do drugs, as there are all sorts of horrors out there waiting. A couple friends of mine listen to your podcast regularly and keep encouraging me to write into you with the story. Now hopefully you find it as creepy as I did, because even though it happened over 15 years ago, it feels like yesterday whenever I remember it. To this day, I still don't know if I should have done something more than I did, and whenever I tell the story, nobody can give me a decisive answer of what they think I should have done either. So maybe you or your listeners can shed some insight or open my eyes to a new perspective. It drives me mad thinking about what else I could have done to help the guy in question in the story. Maybe because it ended with me being so helpless and useless to him. Now for some background, when I was younger, I used to see myself as a bit of a wild explorer survivalist type. I had read all the books, seen all the shows, and kind of enjoyed having this air of rugged mystery to myself. I'm an extremely tall, broad fella, and combined with the sense of immortality you have in your early 20s, I felt pretty invincible. So all of this said, it's the reason why I spent a lot of my time camping by myself. One thing I'd say is that camping by yourself isn't actually the best idea. There's a whole bunch of things that can go wrong, especially if you're deep in the wilderness. If you need help, there's likely going to be nobody around to offer it, and if you come up against any adversity, man or nature, then more often than not, your body's going to be food for the crows, never to be found. Now, I've done my due diligence with warning you about the dangers. I can say that my years camping by myself are freaking awesome. There's nothing like braving it in nature all by yourself, knowing that your own survival relies solely on you and your decisions, and that one wrong step could send you spiraling to your doom, sometimes literally if you stumble off a cliff in the dark. Now, thankfully, I never managed to injure myself in that kind of way, which is a miracle when I look back at how reckless and stupid I could get. At the time, like I said, I enjoyed being a quiet, stoic man of mystery, so I didn't often recount my adventures to friends either. But when I did, they'd always scold me for being so irresponsible and tell me that one day I'd end up dead in a tree. Always in a tree, too, according to one friend of mine who very much enjoyed the comforts of life. Not sure why he always assumed that I climbed into trees, but according to him, that's the way I was going to die. Maybe a leopard or something pulled me up there. I always laughed and brushed them off, and I don't think it really struck me at how correct they were until I found myself responsible for someone else's life. As much as I'd like to brag and tell you all about my death-defying exploits, it's this one final event towards the end of my camping days that really sticks with me. As I've said, I really focused on survival and isolation, so it was pretty rare for me to meet anyone else when I was out hiking. And so one day, 4 days into a planned 8-day hike, I was hella surprised when, almost out of nowhere, a guy came ambling into the clearing where I was setting up my tent. Immediately, I was on the defensive, being pretty much in the middle of nowhere and not having seen another living soul for days. And then, when I finally took in the guy's appearance, I felt more confused than defensive. Everything about this dude was wrong, at least in the middle of nowhere in the forest, that is. The main thing was that while I was decked out in full hiking gear, covered in mud and who knows what else, this guy was wearing what appeared to be a casual business suit. He looked like he'd just come strolling out of the office, at least in terms of what he was wearing. And the more I looked, though, the more disheveled I realized he was, and the more confused and scared he appeared to be. The first thing he said to me was to ask me where we were. I told him very gruffly and still in the defensive, and at first I wasn't sure that he'd heard me, because I have a tendency to sort of mumble and talk quietly. And then I realized his look of puzzlement was because he thought I was lying to him. We engaged in a bit more discussion, and I allowed myself to open up a little and accept that this dude wasn't out to kill me. I soon realized that he was very lost and unsure of himself. I kind of wondered if maybe he was drunk, but he also reminded me of when my great-grandma had suffered from dementia. There was this sort of glassy look in his eyes that disturbed me a little. Relaxing and deciding this guy wasn't a threat, I started being more gentle in how I spoke to him. I managed to coax the info out of him that he had no memory of how he'd woken up in the forest out here in the middle of nowhere, and the last thing he could remember was leaving work for about 4 days before. Either this guy had gone on the mother of all drinking binges, or he really was suffering some kind of severe head trauma. I tried asking if he could remember a blow to the head or anything like that, but he seemed completely unaware of anything that could have led him to where he is now. And let me just stress here for a moment, we really were out in the middle of nowhere. This wasn't somewhere that you could end up after wandering for an hour or so, or even for a day. And it really struck me how wild it was when the guy asked me for help in getting back to civilization, and we went over my map. Unless my wayfinding had somehow become way off, we were about 3 days from where I had left my vehicle in one direction, and about the same distance to the nearest town in the other. I figured that town must be where the guy had come from, and when I mentioned the name, his face actually brightened a little. He lived there with his girlfriend, he said, and he worked in the city during the week. Feeling kind of like an adventurer hero, I suggested to the guy that we camp out where I'd set up my tent so we could get some rest and warm some food up before we began the hike back to civilization the next day. It only struck me a bit later that I was inviting a stranger to watch over me while I slept, who could potentially be very dangerous whether knowingly or not. At the time, I didn't even really consider the ramifications of this, and like I said, I was young and reckless and arrogant. Thankfully, when I woke up the next day, the business suit guy hadn't murdered me in my sleep. He was in fact snoring in an extremely deep sleep cramped up next to me in my one-man tent. I somehow managed to slip out without waking him and wash myself up, and then went about planning our most optimal route. I figured that I'd let this business guy sleep as long as he needed. We could even set out a day later if we had to, and I had enough provisions for probably at this point a year of survival, and the guy seemed to be in perfect physical health. Mentally, I wasn't sure, but I was confident that I could handle or wrangle this rogue businessman. But I prayed that he was just on something rather than suffering from head trauma or dementia. And after he'd woken up for the morning, it became clear that unfortunately this guy was suffering from some kind of mental issue though. He'd frequently drift off while talking to me, and his memory of lost events didn't seem to be any better than the previous night. Occasionally, I'd catch him looking at me in some strange way, almost hungrily or dangerously. And now it's probably obvious that I'm a stubborn idiot at this point, but at the time I refused to accept that this guy could be anything less than legitimate. Hell, maybe I'm only remembering these predatory looks by thinking back on it, I'm not really sure. But either way, I was at least sensible enough to insist that we head towards civilization that day. I loaned this guy some of my spare hiking gear, so he was at least a little equipped for the wilderness. And now that he wasn't wearing a suit, he almost passed as someone who belonged out there with me. And at the very least, he didn't unsettle me every time I looked at him. And as we walked through the woods, I realized that he was a surprisingly competent hiker. Too competent, it felt, looking back on it, but again, that just could be the benefit of hindsight. And as we walked, picking our way over some pretty rough terrain, the guy started talking about some fairly weird stuff. One thing that really sticks out to me was that he kept asking me what my views were on morality, specifically if I believed in an afterlife and what did I think happened to us after we die, etc. Again, looking back, this was really unsettling for a meeting with a stranger out of nowhere under these certain circumstances. Now back then, I kind of was pretentious though, sort of a wannabe intellectual, so I treated his weird conversation topic with sincerity. I guess maybe some of it was adrenaline and denial as well. There wasn't much I could actually do about being stuck out there with a super weird guy, so the best survival tactic I had was denial and to just keep pressing on. This guy really shouldn't have been able to keep up with me if he really was an unprepared, mentally sick guy who found himself in a situation like this. I'm absolutely certain of that now. At the time, though, he managed to keep pace with me despite being a lot shorter and smaller than me, and I really pushed us both through our paces. I should add, too, that the guy looked to be maybe late 30s, early 40s, and I was in my early 20s, so I guess there was a degree of wanting to impress my elders. And there was also the fact of being unaware of just how much difference that age gap should have made to his overall fitness if he was unprepared. After a day's hard hiking, I found a clearing that I previously camped in by myself and told the guy that we'd set the tent up here to take a break for the night. It was by a small creek, so it was a nice camping spot that I used a few times, and we both enjoyed a refreshing wash in the creek, and I settled in to share some rations with him. I hoped that by talking to the guy that I might be able to shake his memory loose, but all I got were these stories about his day job. Most of them sounded kind of made up, like he'd taken them from books or TV shows, but there was nothing I could prove to be a clear lie. The next day, after somehow surviving a second night sleeping next to this dude, we began again. Now I call this second day Predator Day. And thankfully not because business guy revealed himself as a predator, but because he became convinced that we were being stalked by one. Now I'd like to add at this point that the reason I continue to call him business guy is that he never actually told me his name, and I was too much of a hothead to slow down and really ask. And it started within an hour of us going out for the day. The business guy grabbed my arm and slowed me down. At first I got kind of defensive and thought, oh god, this is it, he's making his move. But I summoned my inner Zen and I asked him what was up. He acted like I was stupid for not realizing it, but clammed up like it was some big secret. And then when I coaxed it out of him, he leaned in and whispered to me in a very exaggerated way to say that we were being followed. I told him we definitely weren't, that I'd trained myself to detect if I was being followed. I know I was kind of pretentious, I told you this already, but business guy sort of sneered at this and made as if he was going to say something smartass and then just didn't. Now, looking back now, I'm convinced that he was going to say that I hadn't noticed him following me previously, but I can't be sure. I managed to convince him that we weren't being followed and to keep up the pace. About an hour later, he grabbed my arm again, though, and said something about how he was certain now we were definitely being stalked. Again, I told him we weren't, and I genuinely don't think we were. I asked him if he thought it was a person or a creature, and he said he wasn't sure. He said maybe it was a bear or a mountain lion, and I explained to him that neither of those animals were most likely going to be in this area, and that I definitely wouldn't be camping alone in an area with those kinds of things. Now, the business guy sort of jeered at this as well, as if he knew better than me, and I reminded myself that this guy wasn't well mentally and I was just supposed to be helping him escape. Now, some more time passed and the guy started really freaking out now. He was yelling for our stalker to come out and face us. He started shouting that we had a gun and weren't afraid to use it. Now, as it happens, I did have a gun, a small pistol for protection, but I had made sure not to reveal that to this guy at any point, just in case. I wanted at least one piece of protection for if things went south. At this stage, I was fairly certain that they were about to go south too with all the screaming that this guy was doing. He acted so convinced and certain that we were being stalked that it started making me paranoid as well. And suddenly every movement was a threat. Every noise was an animal creeping up on us. Sure, bears and cougars weren't super common in this area at all, but that didn't mean that there couldn't be a stray killer animal out of its natural habitat, right? And at one point, I just about had a heart attack when a rabbit went dashing past us, disturbed by this business guy's yells. Now, I successfully managed to coax him into calming down and following me again, but this is where the guy starts to unravel. At the time, I assumed it was fatigue or illness affecting him, but sometimes when I play it back, I wonder if it was kind of a hunger. If this guy was planning on doing something terrible to me, and I stress that to this day I still don't know for sure, then maybe the itch to do it was getting under his skin. I don't know if maybe I was subconsciously thinking of this at the time, but I do remember that I pushed us real hard that day, and we continued hiking a while after the sun had gone down, which again is a really stupid thing to do, but at the time, I insisted that we'd be fine to hike by flashlight. I knew the area pretty well, and I also didn't want to stop while this business guy was still muttering about how we were being followed. Now, I'm fairly certain by the end of the day I was convinced that we were being followed too, even though I knew that that was impossible. Certainly, if we were being followed by an animal, it wouldn't have been able to stalk us unseen for an entire day. And finally, I allowed us to set up camp. And by my calculations, which were probably wrong looking back on it, we could reach my car by the next afternoon. I was feeling pretty pleased with myself at our progress. I was also still convincing myself that I'd saved this lost guy while ignoring all the red flags that I'd seen in retrospect. Or if not red flags, then at least pieces of evidence that proved things were entirely as they seemed at face value. I've retold this story countless times, and every time I do tell it, I remember something else I probably should have picked up on. And that night is where everything came to a head. We found a camping spot in the dark, as I said, which was a small miracle given how obscure the area was. My tent was one of those pop-out tents, so it wasn't hard to set up in the dark, and then go about setting up the portable camp heater that I'd been carting around. No campfires in unapproved areas, of course. At least I like to abide by the rules. And we sat around that heater for the third night, and I tried coaxing more memories or details out of this guy. And for the third night, he continued to insist that all he remembered was leaving work in the city and then waking up in the middle of the forest. Now, by now, even back then, I was really starting to question this whole thing, given that this guy had managed to hike back with me just fine despite being allegedly unprepared. I figured that if he hadn't killed me after 3 nights, then he wasn't going to, though, and he had some other reason for wanting me to guide him out of that forest. It felt safe to play along, is really what I'm trying to say. Now, we were ready to go to bed to our tents when the men came bursting into the clearing with flashlights. One of them shouted at me to stay calm and that everything was going to be okay now. Meanwhile, a couple of other guys had grabbed the business guy and were now handcuffing him. I squinted against the light shining in my face trying to make out who these guys were. Now, the way they were acting, they seemed like they were FBI or some other kind of law enforcement agency. And I think they were wearing unmarked jackets though, or at least I couldn't see any identifying marks in the dark. The guy who'd spoken to me flashed a badge at me which looked vaguely legitimate, but again it was very hard to tell in the nighttime, and I also couldn't see specifically which agency the badge was associated with, although in later years I've identified it as being almost certainly FBI. Now, it was an absolute whirlwind. This one guy, an agent or whatever he might have been, was constantly telling me to stay calm and that I was safe, almost as if he was trying to distract my attention from whatever was going on with that business guy. I tried to look around the man blocking my view while shielding my gaze from the flashlight in my eyes, and it seemed like they were bundling that guy away through the trees, and it struck me later that business guy didn't even say a word or make a sound throughout the whole ordeal. I swear I can remember him grinning as they took him away, but again, I could just be adding that detail in my mind. Now, eventually, it was just myself and two of the agents, including the one who repeatedly told me I was safe. I expected them to, I don't know, debrief me or something, at least explain the situation. But no, nothing. They literally told me that I was safe now, and that I had avoided a terrible fate, and then headed off into the trees. Now, at the time, I was completely baffled. Of course, I didn't find out until later that I'd majorly miscalculated our entire route, so we were camping only about a half hour from the road. Finding this out later, it at least made sense how the men were able to locate and reach us, but it still left me with a few baffling and creepy questions. Who the hell was Business Guy, and why did he put on such a show of pretending to be a lost little sheep, if only to escort me back to my car? Was this the most elaborate carjacking ever? I don't know. And it also kills me not to know if the men who showed up were legitimate law enforcement or not. Either I got saved from some terrible fate or I handed Business Guy over to one. And over time, I've come to manage to convince myself that that guy had something awful planned for me. But that's only because the other possibility is probably too horrible to think about. What if I let a person in a genuine need get snatched up by God knows who? Now, I'm fairly certain that that guy was at least a bad player, though, because of a few things. One, that night after everything had died down and the men had left, I checked my pack for security. Now, I was horrified to discover that my gun, which I kept in a holster in a hidden compartment in the bag, was gone. The so-called law enforcement agents never went near my tent, so the gun could only have been taken by that business guy. And as I mentioned, I never told him about the gun. He must have been searching my belongings pretty thoroughly to find it. Secondly, I discovered that the small amount of money that I kept in the same pocket was also gone. Now, it was only about $100 or so, but enough to feel the sting at the time. And thirdly, when I reached the car the next morning, after finding I was much closer to the road than I thought, I made one final horrifying discovery. I have no proof that this was connected to the business guy in any way, but someone had slashed one of my tires. Thankfully only one, so I was able to replace it with a spare easily enough, but it was almost as if it had been done as a delaying tactic just in case. Maybe to give that guy the time to jump me or who knows what. Some of my friends are adamant that I encountered an unidentified serial killer of women who'd been operating near the area for a few years before I camped there. Now, this would explain why he was so sinister but didn't kill me, although it wouldn't explain what his plan or motive really was. Now, I genuinely have no idea, but the more years that passed, the more I'm certain that I narrowly avoided something terrible. I just can't decide if that fate would have been at the hands of the business guy or at the men who showed up at the end. And as much as I want to, I can't convince myself that I didn't just let dangerous people